Welcome everybody to the second to the last talk in this series for the second half. Sarah's going to introduce our speaker, but I wanted to tell you that this is our second to the last talk, and we have evaluation sheets outside. If you haven't gotten one, I'll ask you to pick one up, and you can give them back to me today, or you might want to wait until next week after you hear the final lecture. Okay, thank you. Sarah?
So excited to have Mary Jean with us this afternoon, and thank you for the dedicated who are with us instead of being across the street with the governor. Mary Jean is going to talk today about caring for New Bedford's children, and I just want to give you a little background. She was a docent here in 1980 and then researched and wrote Biographical Dictionary of New Bedford Artists for 10 years, publishing it in 1990. And she worked on the staff here in the curatorial department until retirement, altogether 26 years at the museum. Mary Jean has been a friend of the New Bedford Whaling Museum and a friend of many other organizations in New Bedford, and we're just delighted to have her with us this afternoon. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mary Jean.
Thank you, Sarah. Well, thank you all for coming. I'm not the governor, but I had fun doing this talk. I just wanted to give a little introduction because you might all wonder why I did this particular talk. Well, I was, as Sarah said, in 1990, I was happily working voluntarily here at the museum. I'd finished the book, so I was just kind of resting on my laurels. And then something happened. I had a best friend, and this best friend came to me. She was, at that time, the first development director for New Bedford Child and Family. Prior to that, she had done some miraculous things at Bishop Stang in the first position as development director there. So Arlene McNamee, who was heading up New Bedford Child and Family, snatched her away and brought her in. Well, this was just before they were going to celebrate their 150th anniversary. So at that time, she came to me and told me that in 1985, Bobby Collins, who was one of the initial founders of the docent program here with Betsy McBratney and some others, in 1985 had donated to the Whaling Museum all the archives from New Bedford Child and Family Service. So we had all their records here. Bobby Collins at that time was chair of the board of New Bedford Child and Family Services. So they were here in our archives. So Marlene said, wouldn't I like to write a little book about that so she could use it at their 1993 150th anniversary? Well, I said, okay. She and I were always coming up with brilliant ideas to give each other trouble. So this was just another one. So she asked me if I would overview the first 100 years, because the first 100 years were all in handwritten secretarial notes. So I said, okay. And as I tackled this project, I fell in love with it. It was just incredible. Even though some of the handwriting was really difficult to interpret, I managed to get it all, and you got the feeling of the secretaries too by following their handwriting, which is something you just don't do today. So I am giving a tribute to Marlene. Her daughter is here today, or her oldest daughter, I should say, because she had 5 children, and she always had projects going with them. So anyway, just that is why you see Marlene O'Neill up on the picture, because she was the one that made me do it. So here we are. So to set the scene, we are mostly talking about the 1800s here. And prosperity came to the area of New Bedford in the early 1800s. They survived the 1778 attack by the British. 4,000 British troops marched through the city and burned what they could, so it was pretty devastated. But by this time, the Roaches from Nantucket, the Rodmans from Newport, had come here to establish a whaling cartel, much like what was going on in Boston. They wanted to have their own. They had a deep harbor here. They could establish land businesses and refining oil and shipyards and shipping, so that by 1823, New Bedford had surpassed Nantucket as a whaling port, and with the citizenry working diligently, the city was on its way to becoming the wealthiest in the nation per capita by 1857. In fact, at this time, residents were working so hard that the shipwrights went on strike because they wanted to reduce their work hours to 10 hours a day. The culture of the town was changing. The Seamen's Bethel was built across the street that's just been rehabbed, so you'll have to go take a look at it later on after the governor leaves. The New Bedford Port Society was established for the moral improvement of seamen. The Anti-Slavery Society was organized and appointed William Roach Jr. its president. The African Christian Church was dedicated in 1830 as the first black church in New Bedford. And in 1838, the fugitive slave and his wife, Frederick Douglass, were ushered into the city by two Quaker gentlemen, William Tabor and Joseph Ricketson. With this context, during the early decades of the 19th century, the citizens of New Bedford began to respond to the social needs of the community. There was a changing view of children within the religious societies. Children were no longer considered to be innately sinful. Parents no longer felt compelled to enforce humiliating and merciless treatment to shape their progeny. The old rules for rearing children had been dictated by the doctrines of fervent Protestant beliefs. The social and political democracy of the day set the stage for parents to use affection and good example to encourage their children in proper behavior. Parents began to see children in a new light, innocent and guileless, like you see in this picture. Children needing nurturing and a secure home life with good teaching to mold their lives for future productivity. Women were viewed as the prime nurturing and educational figures of the children's lives. It also became the Christian duty of the educated lady of means to serve society by taking care of the poor and afflicted. The painting you see here shows the children of our local artist, William Allen Wall, who had just come back from studying in England and Italy. At that time, there were no schools for artists here. They had to learn from other artists. And to take the European tour really enhanced his painting. And you can just see the romantic movements of his two daughters, Mary and Annie, who were painted in 1842. And that painting went up to the Boston Athenaeum to be shown shortly thereafter. In 1839, the Reverend John H. Morrison served as a new associate minister for the First Congregational Society Unitarian. This is the same church you see up on the corner of County and Union Streets. It still exists today. Reverend Morrison was the first to suggest the need in New Bedford for an institution to care for the city's impoverished children. After a thorough investigation, he concluded after coming to the city, and these are his words, that there were many children, some without any parents, some with parents worse than none, in the greatest destitution and wretchedness, surrounded by every kind of moral exposure, some brought up to beggary and petty thieving, with none to care for them, and on the road to all but certain ruin. It wasn't vain to think of finding places for them in private families, and yet it was plain that were there some institution rightly organized and conducted, where they might be brought under good influences, there was no reason to doubt that they might grow up to be good and useful men and women. From 1839 to 1843, Reverend Morrison worked along with others to establish the New Bedford Orphans' Home. By 1843, there were 70 whale ships returning and 92 leaving the harbor. The lives of the majority of New Bedford's male inhabitants were regulated only by their adventurous sojourns on the oceans. Reverend Ephraim Peabody, whom you see here in this portrait, was the leading minister of the First Congregational Society Unitarian, and he said in his address at the first public meeting of the Orphans' Home in 1842, "There is no place on earth where there are 13,000 inhabitants, where 7,000 seamen come and go, where there are the usual changes of fortune, where there are not children who are left friendless." And I have to put in a little tribute here to Reverend Ephraim Peabody, because he said a saying that was most clairvoyant. So if you'll excuse me, I have to read it. "It requires a woman's heart and a woman's eye to understand and appreciate the wants of children. They are the proper managers of such an institution. They are less likely to be deceived, more likely to conduct it affectionately, more likely to give their time and attention to it. And I believe that all experience shows that charities under their charge, are managed with more perseverance, more discrimination, more faithfully, and more economically than those conducted by men." Religion. I just thought that was very clairvoyant. Religion played a large part in the lives of the local residents. The majority had belonged to the Society of Friends, known as the Quaker faith. However, times were changing. There had been a schism in the New Bedford Quaker meeting, as young people in particular rejected the constrictions of a plain lifestyle. Many left this congregation and joined the Congregational Unitarian Church that had just been built and were energized by the new ministers. Between the new religious leaders, Reverend Ephraim Peabody, whom you just saw, Reverend John Morrison, whom unfortunately I couldn't find a portrait, and then this Reverend Enoch Mudge. He was brought in as the first leader of the Seamen's Bethel. The edict went out that the women of New Bedford should be encouraged to take on the task of rescuing these destitute, abandoned children. Reverend Enoch Mudge lived between 1776 and 1850 and led the congregation from 1832 to 1844 and became the model for Father Maple in Moby Dick for Herman Melville. He stated that these ladies were uniquely qualified to assume such responsibilities. They came from the Society of Friends, or Quaker heritage, which believed in the equality of all individuals and conferred leadership positions to their women. Many of these women found themselves raising their children and running the households by themselves while their husbands spent months and years at sea. So the ministers approached a group of ladies that they thought would be just the perfect people to run the orphanage. This is actually a stage photo, but gives you some idea of what they might have dressed like in those days. Rebecca Waln Morgan Robin, who I had hoped her portrait would be here because she's my favorite portrait in the whole museum. She was appointed first directress of the Orphans Museum home. And she was a sister of Charles Waln Morgan and came with other Waln Morgan sisters to marry other Roaches and Rodmans here because they were all Quakers. And as you can see from her dress, she was parting way with the dress prescribed by the Quaker faith, which was usually plain, favoring shades of gray and brown. We have a lot of that here. She married William Roach Rodman, who built the mansion that still stands up on County Street next to the Roach Jones Stuff House. You can see the elaborate design of the house, that the Quaker simplicity is waning. And it is interesting to see the two homes together because you definitely see Quaker in one, and then the more elaborate design of the other, moving on to other religions. And at this time, County Street was mansion mania, just like happened here a few years ago. It was just a row of big, huge homes being built. To get up the street, it was a suburb. They were moving into the suburbs, away from the smell and the busyness of the waterfront. When Rebecca died in 1848, the ladies who guided the orphans' home remarked in her eulogy of her devotion to the institution, her liberal spirit of philanthropy, her obliging disposition, and her ever-active energy. She was admired and would be missed. By November of 1842, these ladies had organized a society, elected officers, and rented a house at the south end of Water Street on Point Road. The house was located in the vicinity of the meeting of Route 18 and Cove Street in the south end of the New Bedford, probably about where the library Casa du Sade is today, near the seawall. They rented the property from Samuel Leonard for $200 a year, hired a matron and an assistant, and on November 15th, 1842, 4 children rescued from the haunts of vice moved in that day. Soon the matrons had 8 children in residence for whom the orphanage had legal guardianship, and 3 boarders for whom they cared for temporarily while their single parent or guardian worked and paid board. At this time, there was no daycare. A single mother who had to work and didn't have family that could take a child had to leave her child in a boarding situation with the orphanage, and she had to pay for this service, and she could only see the child very few times in the year. The orphanage was in a lovely area, rural, and this is what Clark's Point Road looked like in a painting by William Allen Wall in the middle 19th century. It was used, obviously, for Sunday outings to be in the fresh air and sunshine. Also abutting the peaceful surrounds of the orphanage was a road we know as West Rodney French Boulevard. The ladies applied for and were granted an official charter that named the corporation New Bedford's Orphans' Home on March 3rd, 1843. Eventually, William Roach Rodman purchased the house from Samuel Leonard and sold it for $3,000 to the Board of Managers who oversaw the home. At the same time, in comparison, William Roach Jr. most generously sold an adjacent parcel of land to the home for $1. At this time, many money issues were still involved the men. The women managers, who numbered 16, were extremely busy setting the rules and regulations concerning the residence of its inhabitants, and that, first off, they only took children between certain ages, like 3 to 6 for the boys, 3 to 8 for the girls. I'm not sure exactly what that was. Maybe they just didn't want infants, but in any way, that's what it was. And then different committees I had to screen all the applications and acceptances for either permanent or boarding residents, and they had to hire workers for repairs to the house. They had to visit the house at least twice a week by a specified committee. They switched committees around to oversee health, education, and well-being of the young ones. Another committee was involved with purchasing the food and other necessities. There was also the overseeing and hiring of the manager of the home, the teacher, and the other workers that had to work on the home, and see that the children were going, hopefully, to a local school. Sometimes they had a teacher in residence, but if they could go to a local school, they found the children enjoyed that more. Then there was the making of all the clothing. You couldn't just run down to Walmart or Target and buy a few children's clothes. And they apparently, the women, or maybe they had somebody in their own household because they all came from the upper echelon in the mansions, they had to make all the clothing for the children. And of course, there was always the fundraising. In 1842, James Arnold held an exhibition and sale of flowers on his property, and he realized for them $25.04. Several ladies gave a private concert, raising $23.25. And then there was Miss Eliza Rodman and Mrs. Charles Grinnell. They went to door, calling on about 100 families to raise $3.75. So it was a constant challenge. The second first directress was Caroline Stockton Roach, Mrs. William Rodman Roach, as opposed to the first directress, who was Mrs. William Roach Rodman. So you have to kind of they were all interrelated. Caroline was a daughter of a United States senator from Princeton, New Jersey, and obviously married Mr. William Roach Rodman, or William Rodman Roach. Each and every woman involved with the orphans' home undertook great responsibilities, and many became incredibly dedicated workers for the needy children. And reading through all the minutes of all the meetings, I was amazed to find how many of them committed volunteer service for 30 and 40 and 50 years to the society, working in various capacities to enhance the lives and be mentors of so many young children. In the appendix of the history I did, I felt compelled to write a brief tribute to some of these ladies. The board as a whole met monthly for many, many years in the homes of various managers. Sarah Roach Arnold. Now here she's living in the house that is now the Wamsutta Club. Her husband was James Arnold. Her father was William Roach Jr., and she was therefore related to the rest of them. She was a devoted worker, and when the Reverend William Potter gave her eulogy, he mentioned that one of her last acts of charity before her death was gathering flowers and working for the annual fundraiser for the orphans. This is a picture of her home, what, as I said, is now the Wamsutta Club. And it also, after she died, and then later on James Arnold died, it came to Clara Morgan Roach. Now, Clara Morgan was daughter of Charles Morgan, who was living just down the street in what used to be the high school, the New Bedford High School, but now it's, I think it's offices for the New Bedford school system. Anyway, so they all lived a few houses from each other. And she also was the niece of Rebecca Morgan Rodman. So here, that puts that all together. And here you can see, well, maybe not so well in this picture, but right here, there are huge greenhouses. And they owned a whole block at that time. It was all gardens and trees, and every Sunday it was open to the people of New Bedford to come and enjoy. And there was one time where Clara Morgan Roach, Mrs. William J., used to sit in the front hall, and anybody who was had money issues, they would come and meet with her, and if they could plead their case, she would fund them for whatever it was they needed. So it's a house that has quite a history. Let's see now here. The Civil War years were most difficult for the home. There was a downturn in the economy. Whaling had reached its peak by the 1860s. By 1868, Eliza Nye Perry Swift, Mrs. William C. N. Swift, was elected first directress, and she served until 1885. Many changes occurred during her tenure, including sending the older children over 6 years of age to the Water Street Primary School. Thus, the resident teacher could devote more time to the younger ones, instructing them in knitting, sewing, and other household skills. In 1874, the orphans' home was modernized at great expense with the introduction of running water. I was thinking that's, they worked a long time out of wells, I guess. But that only, the water was piped in from Acushnet. And that only led to another challenge. 13 years later, eels began to come through the water pipes, and the ladies had to seek help from an influential person on the water board to correct the situation. After the Civil War, many benevolent societies began developing as the textile industry was growing heads and bounds and attracted a huge influx of foreign workers. At one point in the book, I remember there were something like probably 20 different nationalities living within this city. The local community was constantly confirming the supportive needs for the children. A Dr. Vermine and a Dr. Swift offered free medical services, and the children were invited to many social gatherings. Mrs. Swift herself had the children, invited them to the from the orphanage to her farm at Rockland in Dartmouth for outdoor games of tilting and swinging and running about. And of course, there were always the delights of eating strawberries and cake and cream. In the 1870s, there was a lot of questioning beginning, especially in the office of the Secretary of the Board of State Charities, concerning the efficacy of orphan asylums. The New Bedford managers resisted the new placing out methods employed by many orphan societies, such as the New York Children's Aid Society and the Home for Little Wanderers in Boston. These organizations participated in a migration unique to America's history. They embraced Charles Loring Brace's solution of sending their great quantity of destitute, abandoned, and orphaned children out west on what became known as orphan trains. These children were relocated to towns to find homes and be taken in by any family that would have them without any serious investigation into the demeanor of the family. The prevailing philosophy was that of the Protestant work ethic, believing that children could be saved by hard work to be found in the developing Western American communities. It has been estimated that between 1853 and 1929, 200,000 children were shipped out west from Eastern, primarily New York and Boston. Amelia Hickling Jones, whom you see in this photograph, was the daughter of Captain Edward Coffin Jones, whose vast wealth was amassed through the whaling industry. He had purchased the mansion of William Roach Jr. when Mr. Roach passed away in 1850. Amelia inherited much of her father's fortune and became one of the city's most philanthropic women. She was dedicated to the work of caring for children, although she never married or had children of her own, and supported the agency with service and financial aid for 51 years. She also was affiliated with Solimar Hospital in Dartmouth, which was for, I believe it was for crippled children or children that had problems, physical problems. Amelia's home, which we've talked about, was built for William Roach Jr. and his second wife in 1834, and is the only mansion, whaling mansion, still in existence that is open to the public. And it sits on its original city block of gardens on County Street. James Arnold and William Roach Jr. would have competitions on what they were growing in their gardens. It was a home where many of the board meetings of the orphan homes were held. The managers did a study in 1876 of nearly 300 children who had been residents of New Bedford's orphans' home. It was found that 90% were now leading useful and industrious lives, and not one had become a habitual criminal. However, they did feel that the time had come for a new building to house the children. With the growth of the city and the textile mills, and the neighborhood had changed in the area of Point Road and Cove Street, and a new location was sought to better serve the young ones. Plans were made to sell the building and the surrounding land and purchase a lot and build on Tabor Street, close to the city. And some of you might recognize this building because it still exists. In October of 1898, the ladies hoped to create a real home where the personality of a child is recognized and developed in a positive environment. The new facility was ready to accommodate the 30 children and their 5 adult caretakers. The governesses, seamstress, cook, and teacher would be able to promote good health and meet emotional needs and education needs, such as could be accommodated in a good family setting. All the furnishings and the belongings were moved into their new home. The children were enthralled with their new abode, its cheerful, sunny rooms, its new sleeping quarters, its new backyard playground, which offered enough room for what became a state award-winning vegetable garden, and its sunny piazza. In 1907, Amelia Jones, who loved children and animals, as she is shown here with her beloved German shepherds, was appointed one of the 3 members of a committee to study institutional versus foster care for dependent children. After much study, Amelia, Mary Roach, and Emma Hall suggested it was time to adopt a form of placing out and close the New Bedford Orphans Home. So by March 1909, they'd only lived in this huge facility for 10 years. The board moved on this momentous decision to adopt a new form of childcare. The placing out program had been promoted in recent years with the new advent of social work as a recognized profession. The method of caring for the children in individual foster homes would prompt the closing of the home. The advantages were many for this type of arrangement if it were supervised properly. After 67 years of caring for only white Protestant children, the agency would now offer services to children no matter what age, race, color, or religion in private homes, having been investigated and selected as for foster parenting. By 1910, the home and property were sold to St. Luke's Hospital. And if you look at St. Luke's from the front, it's over on the right. And I believe, Judy, you would know, it was a nursing for the nurses. Originally, it was housing the nurses for many, many years. Now I believe it's just offices. It was sold to St. Luke's for $16,000, and the new method of caring for needy children was established and overseen by professional workers. However, the Board of Managers continued, and the name was changed to Children's Aid Society. Many new projects involving children came into their purview. In 1960, they began operating the first children's medical clinics in the city, in the basement of Knowlton School and the Green School. And during one year they serviced 1,483 children, they decided that the treatment would be better if they turned the clinic over to the outpatient department of St. Luke's Hospital. During this year, the reasons for coming to the Children's Aid Society were, interestingly enough, 8% unruliness, 11% ill health, 11% ill health of the parents, 26% to board until the family could thrive, 37% permanent care, and 4% detention before court action. So they covered all different bases now. They promoted recreational activities for adolescent and older boys. Boys were always a problem, as they are today, of course. And seriously studied the problems of young unwed mothers. During the Roaring '20s, the problems of illegitimate children concerned 25% of their work. In the 1927-28 annual report, an interesting observation was made. This year, for the first time, a more tolerant trend was noted. An unprecedented number of girls were able to remain at home or in the homes of relatives until their babies were born. And more of these girls were keeping their babies and braving adverse criticism. During the Depression and war years, milk programs were run to maintain the health of youngsters. Applications for assistance rose to 968 requests. Half of these cases involved poverty and unemployment. And they worked with the Family Welfare Society, a society that had been founded in 1894 to support and keep families intact. Miss Olive Hustis of the Family Welfare Society is seen in this photograph visiting a family in need in 1939. She later became Mrs. Olive Harrop and worked for 45 years in the field of adoption at New Bedford Child and Family. Eventually, in 1945, the Children's Aid Society, headed by a powerful board president, Mrs. Oliver Prescott, and joined with the Family Welfare Society, which was headed by another dedicated board president, Mrs. George B. Knowles. By 1947, with Edna B. Carlson serving as executive secretary of both agencies, they legally merged and became New Bedford Child and Family Service, moving into offices at the Rodman House at 106 Spring Street. After many years of operating from this office building, a move was made to renovate and occupy a large building at 1061 Pleasant Street in the city. And here the story comes full circle. The historic house was the home of one of the charter founders of the orphans' home, Mrs. Abby Howland Robinson, where New Bedford Child and Family continues to this day to serve and care for the city's children and their families. Abby and her husband, Edward Mott Robinson, were the parents of Hetty Howland Robinson Green. So this, again, Marlene got me involved in this as well. Hetty's Thrift Shop is in this building. And that was Marlene's idea. And I helped work with Lil Carney and Maggie Purrington and Chris O'Hara and Jane Rio back in the 1990s and established. And that's still thriving and supports the agency and also is help if children need clothing or something of that nature. They can get it from the Hetty's Thrift Shop. I have only given you an overview of 100 years of handwritten records that tell a very detailed story of decades of work undertaken by the women managers of the orphans' home. Every time a new secretary came along, I prayed they had good handwriting. I have only been able to mention a few of those who gave so willingly and unsparingly of their time and talents for the benefit of the needy children. There were tough decisions always to make, worries, disappointments, obstacles, triumphs, constant hard work, and persistent monetary concerns, often due to various downturns in the economy. I was so impressed by the dedication of these successive generations of women who gave so many years of devotion and self-sacrificing service to building one of the oldest benevolent institutions in the city that still exists today, 174 years later. And as you can see on the screen, as the agency has evolved, it has now adopted another name. It's Child and Family Services because it services 8 different communities. It has 11 offices throughout southern New England and employs 483 employees servicing the needs of family. And as to their continued purpose, this is their message. Through counseling, prevention programs, family support, psychiatric services, we are able to keep the commitment we first made in 1843 of helping those in need. Our mission remains to heal and strengthen the lives of children and families. And there it is. Does anybody have any questions? I know you might, yes?
Let me just give you the mic. Hold on. So we can all hear your question.
Thank you. Growing up in New Bedford, the only orphanage I would hear about was the Catholic orphanage
Yes.
on Kempton Street.
Yes, and if you weren't good, you could be sent there.
We were threatened, yes. Was there any relation between these two groups at all?
I'm not sure about what relationship there might have been. That was not established till 1893. So by that time, they were beginning to think about placing out and things of that nature. But I'm sure there were some contact back and forth before, But since it was so late, by that time they were already beginning to, as I say, think about taking everybody in that needed it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions?
Well, thank you. Thank you for coming.
Next week, we'll have Val Bassett from the Women's Fund. She is our final speaker. She's going to talk about women's issues of today. So I hope you'll join us for the last in this series next Thursday at 2:30. Thank you so much.